Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we're talking about objects, or beginning our conversation about objects, kind of switching from institutions and the shells that create the objects into the actual things. And the reason why I'm so large is not because of my aching narcissism. It's actually because I wanted to show you this thing. This thing is a clay pot that was produced by one of my dear friends when we were in college. She was my college roommate, and she took a ceramics class with her brother. It's really dusty, sorry. She took a ceramics class with her brother and produced this thing. And it was the first thing that she had ever glazed. And that's why the outside has this kind of, well, maybe you can see it. It's pretty gnarly. It's not the most, what people would say, attractive. Inside is this real, bright yellow color. So basically, she made this thing, and these like weird little legs. She made this thing, and she kind of hated it, and I loved it. And so I decided to keep it. And at a certain point, the Institute for American Art decided to put this on view. And when we did, we associated the monetary value with it. And regardless of what that monetary value was, it was probably, I don't know, $20,000 or something. It was associative with the emotional value that I had invested into this thing. So this project that my husband John and I had put together was about taking an object and quantifying its financial value or economic exchange value through its emotional content. And so, for instance, a quilt that he made me that was an appropriation of the exact composition of an Ellsworth Kelly painting we put in this catalog for $3 million because that was the most amount of money or the lowest amount of money actually, that I would have needed to part ways with this work of culture, this objet d'art, as the French would say. Yeah. So essentially what we are talking about today is then auratic objects. Let me move this little guy up here. I'll adjust that size later. On this notion of objects that have an aura. Auratic objects. I also like that alliteration or the sound familiarity between that and erratic. Because objects that are auratic are potentially erratic. In that aura that we read off of them, that thing, that it's not even necessarily the meaning or really even the content, it's just that vibe, that vibration, quite honestly, that comes off of objects that we interpret as their aura. And I say that aura is erratic because it really is relative to who is sensing that aura. You might pick up this thing, look at it, and say, that's a really ugly pot. And I picked up this thing and I thought, that's an ugly pot worth saving. And now that I've held on to it for so long, it's become something even more influential to me. It's become a talking piece for one of my graduate seminars. It has become a thing that holds actually some coins from around the world. So it's kind of this repository of thoughtful treasures. And I'm still friends with Margaret. And so it's nice that I get to have this thing of hers. And so I kind of have for lack of a better word, a kind of piece of her with me. Now, it's that kind of a thing, that kind of an emotional sentiment, that a lot of art objects, they might not strive for that kind of sentimentality, but they strive for that kind of emotional conveyance, that bearing of honesty with regard to what the thing feels like, what its intentions are, and what your relationship is to those feelings and those intentions. Okay, so hang tight one sec. I'm going to pause and put this pot back. See, now you can see it. It's right. Ooh, right there. There. Boom. On my shelf of knickknack. Okay, so to make this lecture kind of brief or brief enough, what I want to talk about is the McCracken text, Grant McCracken, the Douglas Crimp text, as well as the Carol Duncan text. I'm going to be speaking less specifically about the Carol Duncan text, and I'm also not going to be putting in a second lecture about institutions, because I realize that I was workshopping what I was going to say to you, and it was essentially almost duplicitous to the lecture I gave over the summer. And so I trust when you read Carol Duncan, some of these things came to light. Duncan is kind of a person who haunts my practice as someone who studies museums. And so the way that I speak of museums is kind of through the writing of Duncan, or like Duncan is behind me and with me as I say these things. And so I don't feel the need to basically lecture on that thing. But the Douglas Crimp text and the Grant McCracken text, I think, are two really interesting ways to think about the idea of possession, of taking possession, and of imbuing whatever that possession is with a certain kind of meaning or power, as it were. Now, the conversation here is called "If I Give You a Gift." On erratic objects, and the reason why I wanted to focus on gift giving was a few reasons. A The potlatch. I understand that I didn't get a chance to really talk to many of you at the end of the trip in New York, like actually in the new museum, and so but I do understand that Shelby and Ben were the ones chosen to give something over at that potlatch. The rest of you were not, and I am sorry that didn't work out, but that kind of feeds into this conversation that we're going to have today about the power of objects, about what objects can convey, and about why we keep objects around because of what they convey. And those are things that are conversations deep within the convoluted text that is Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx. Go through that at your own pace. I recommend talking to one another about that text, because talking through people like Derrida with other human beings is really, really, really helpful. And it is also helpful to do it in person, in situ. So maybe what we'll do is at some point in the summer is kind of like rally round and just ask questions about like how can we use an idea like hauntology as a way to talk about art practice. And I think we already do. I think we talk about ideas of influence and ideas of inspiration in that way, but we can unpack all of these texts in just further conversation, because we're going to be colleagues for another year. Isn't that fun? So anyway, I digress. Essentially, Derrida talks about gifts, and he talks about influence, and in a way that is similar to potlatch and similar to basically essentially identifying what power or agency a thing has. Now, to talk about this, this conversation of objects or gifts having a kind of cultural agency is not one that is new, in which case it is old hat. Ha ha ha, pun intended. There's an old hat. It's a hat, whatever. But it's also a hat in a case, which makes us think that maybe that hat has some sort of level of power to it. You know, it's powerful, and thereby it needs to be contained. That containment is either for its safety or for our safety, or for the safeguarding of the object because it's deemed valuable in some regard. You know, these are the reasons why you put things behind glass. You don't want them to get damaged. You don't want people to steal them, or it needs to be locked away because it's dangerous, i.e. animals in a zoo. Those are the other things behind glass. And I'm just looking over here at my bookshelf to see where my Grant McCracken is, because I love that Grant McCracken book, and I recommend it all the time. And I'll find it at some point, maybe while looking on another shelf. Anyway, putting things behind glass, things being old hat, these notions they're known. They are expected. They are the things that we anticipate in culture, and they are old hat. Okay, but what happens when that hat has this signature on the top of it? What happens when that hat is explained. Its power, its reason for being behind glass is explained to you. When you are told that the tiger can come at you and can kill you, you are therefore, you understand the glass. You understand the aura of the object or the power of the animal, and therefore you need the glass. You want that glass to be the impeding position. In this case, when you realize that that hat is potentially, or is realistically, this hat worn by Joseph Beuys for the majority of his professional career as a sculptor, artist, genius, doer of magic, and shaman, this object becomes something that we might want to steal, something that we might want to touch. It becomes, to a certain extent, a hagiographic object. What did I just say? A hagiographic object. Meaning it's an object of a saint, meaning it's an object, the object that has to do with the making of a saint. And Joseph Beuys, in wearing this hat, has turned this object into a relic. He's imbued it with a certain kind of power that allows it to exist in a different way than other hats. There's plenty of other hats that look like that. But that hat, being identified as the one that was worn by Joseph Beuys, even one that wears his signature, is here presented as an object, a rarefied object, an object of importance. This importance we can talk about with regard to this word, mana. Mana. Mana, let's just pull that down a little bit. Mana is defined through gift exchange and actually through a book. I got books everywhere through this book, The Gift. Now, there's this book, The Gift. This is the gift that everybody likes to read because this is the gift that makes you feel good about gift giving. It makes you think about the gift that you give the world. It's really nice. It's also not really a critical text, so if you love that book, don't cite it. This book, however, by Marcel Mauss, published in 1913, 1912. Mauss is a sociologist, and he is it was published in 1954, but I believe that it was published sooner than that because Mauss died in 1950. So I'm sorry to say that I do not know the publication date for this text called The Gift. I'm almost positive it's 1913. Anyway, he was an anthropologist and a sociologist, and he went and studied this idea of exchange, of gift exchange, specifically of potlatch, through the writings of Tamati Ranapiri of the Ngate Raukawa tribe. Ngati Raukawa. That's how that's said. So essentially, he is studying how people exchange gifts. And he goes into this culture and he sees that there is this thing that is largely referred to as mana. Not manna, like the stuff that rained down that one day to make sure that Christian people had food from their God as written in their Bible. No, this has to do with the idea of gifts, right? And so there's this gift exchange that Mauss is articulating or writing about in this book. And he talks about this idea that there is a mana. And he defines mana as power, as visibility, as stature, and as authority. In other words, objects that were personal to a person had, to a certain extent, kind of gleaned a little bit of the mana off of that individual. This sweater, that's a weird example. I'm going to go back up to the Joseph Beuys. Joseph Beuys' hat. This hat does not have a kind of mana inherent in it. or it does, but it's not one. It's one of a hat. It's one of a felt hat. It's not a big deal. It's just a felt hat. It might be a nice felt hat, but it's just a felt hat. But when that hat adorns the head of this person, this artist, specifically in the production of his artwork and in the production of his persona, which identifies through the use of a uniform, this hat gleans, takes off some of the mana or the power, the visibility, the stature, the authority of a Joseph Beuys, and it conveys that sense. It conveys that power, that agency, that whatever it is, visibility, stature, authority. And so this thing becomes a token of mana. And so if Joseph Beuys gives you this gift in a potlatch exchange, there is the understanding that there needs to be some sort of equality in your presentation back. Or rather than equality, I should say equity. Equity is contingent on the mana of the individual. In other words, if Joseph Beuys gave me this hat, I would drop down, I would start crying, I would freak out, I would be so touched that this man, this person who's kind of a shaman to me, has bequeathed to me this gift. I would be moved beyond all recognition. And in response, even without the potlatch system, I would be so giving. I would want him to come over for dinner and I'd cook him the best meals. I would want to show him as many things as I possibly could. I would want to like shower him with as much appreciation and as much reciprocal, that's the word I'm looking for, reciprocal uh, thing. But because his mana is so much more than mine, at least in my conception of this, there are some people that I mean more to them than Joseph Beuys, like my mom. She doesn't know who Joseph Beuys is. I carry more mana than Joseph Beuys. But back to me. Because I'm me and Joseph Beuys is Joseph Beuys, to me, I put so much more mana into, or so I identify so much more mana in this object, and I want to give, according to that stature variation, I want to give him back a gift that is tenfold better because I feel as though I am required. So that's kind of without the potlatch system. But because anthropologists needed some concrete way of talking about what they saw, of analyzing these cultures, they needed to find examples. And Mauss found this tribe that had not only experienced this potlatch system of economy and economic exchange for many generations, but they had been articulating it in their own words. They had been talking about it, and that's who this Tamati Ranampiri is. So Mauss is essentially reporting what Tamati Ranampiri is saying, and I'm going to say both of those words in this name because I'm not sure. I don't want to drop one and be dropping the inappropriate one. So anyway, this person, Mauss is reporting on their exchange, on their exchange system through this guy. And so that's really good and concrete. And so that's why I talk about this with regard to potlatch, even though this old hat can be understood as a gift exchange at a family celebration. Now that gift exchange at the family celebration has this guy floating through it, or this entity, this feeling, this vibration. How, how. No, I'm kidding. That's not how you say it. Ho. I'm kidding. That's not how you say it. How. I'm kidding. That's not how you say it. Huh? Say it however you want to say it. This is essentially the engine of reciprocity. This is the emotion that is that vibe that comes off of the auratic object. When an object has mana, it is using or deploying this idea of how. I hate saying this word. I really do. How. I'm pretty sure that's how you would say it. How. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say all those letters. H-A-U. How. So, how. This idea of hau is summed up in an analysis actually of Mauss from 1972 that says, again, very old hat, you give something to me, your spirit, hau, in that thing obliges me to reciprocate. So the hat is the object. Mana is the whole thing. Hau is the thing, is the part that's gleaned off of you before you give a gift to someone else. We all understand these things because we have all been involved in gift exchanges. We've all received bad gifts. We've all been the recipient of gifts that have maybe demanded a kind of reciprocity that you didn't understand. Not to say, I mean, that sounds really lascivious actually when I say it out loud like that. But I just remember even as a kid when somebody would show up to a birthday party, let's say, with a present, they would anticipate that you would show up to their birthday party with a better present. Hau. So, hau and mana. Hau and mana, essentially, according to Mauss, according to the Derrida, who doesn't use these terms but does talk about these ideas, these so what we have here is essentially that idea that there is this haunting, that an object, when passed from one person to the next, hang on, I need to make sure this is hit. Anyway, sorry, tech things. Anyway, so every object that is exchanged between any two people has this kind of hau to it. And the great thing about hau is the first three letters of haunt, right? So that hau is part of a haunting. That's where those two things connect. That's the relationship between those two objects. So, oop, live at it, live at it. Francesco de Goya, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, from Los Caprichos. This is an etching that comes from, as you can see, 1799. And this idea that that a haunting occurs is something that artists have been dealing with and everyone has really understood for quite some time. It's part of the spiritual vocabulary of almost every culture, that there is some conversation with an afterlife, except, of course, the atheistic spiritual culture, which is so in a state that they don't want to talk about the fact that they're a spiritual dogma. But anyway, to all of you atheists out there, think about it. What do you believe? You believe in something. Anyway, I digress. So this idea, I just wanted to show you some artwork that had haunting in it actually, and I confess. So here is Goya's Sleep of Reason, and this idea that you have this enlightened individual, an individual who understands something like history, who understands something like cultural transmission, who understands the notion of culture from an objective point of view. Because that's what's happening in the Enlightenment. It's the introduction of objectivity and subjectivity in conversation with one another. Everybody thinks it's one, other people think it's the other. It doesn't matter. It's actually both. And so that self-reflexivity, the understanding of your participation in a culture of reason, produces monsters. And those monsters, we can say, are history. We can say they're the influences that are haunting us. We can say that it's I mean, it's all manner of things. I mean, this is the notion of where fear comes from as well. When you are the victim of a violent crime, you are afraid of that crime being repeated. And so you have, through the revival of this history, this replaying of this event. But that can swing to good things as well. And so this idea of haunting or of a cultural transmission as rooted in this kind of conversation is not necessarily one that we need to be afraid of. It's like Dia de los Muertos, where you celebrate the dead. We need to be celebrating the dead that are with us. And if we don't want to celebrate them, we need to figure out how to get them out of the room. Now, somebody like Nathan Conley is presenting a work called Unnamed, and it's these tombstones that don't have any name inscriptions on them. And so maybe the idea is that we could come into this room and project our own mortality onto these things and view them as a memento mori. Um, I kind of think this is a whack exhibition, but I like the materiality of the tombstones. Again, this is just me trying to show you work that has to do with haunting and kind of bewitching culture. But this is a little bit more to the point. Um, so, in uh, from a very early time period, I can't remember the exact dates right now, and I don't have those notes in front of me. My apologies. But there was the introduction between two people that would form what is referred to as Société Anonyme. Société Anonyme was put together by Catherine Dreyer, Marcel Duchamp were the two primary collaborators. And as you can see, in 1927, Société Anonyme was not only established enough, but at a point in its trajectory that it could stage something like a retrospective in the Brooklyn Museum. But here we have Dreyer and Marcel Duchamp in the actual building of Société Anonyme, and you can see Duchamp's large glass as well as another work to in the back. Dreyer was friends with Duchamp, an artist in her own right, and the two of them collaborated with Man Ray. And the reason why I wanted to show you Société Anonyme is because this was a group of artists that came together and understood that there was something else going on with regard to art that needed to be addressed. There was a kind of a vibrancy in the object that needed to be negotiated. And so what they began to do, as is evidenced in not only this slide, which shows the interior of a domestic space, although one with quite an awesome collection of books, all leather bound, of course, because Dreyer was a classy lady. But in this image of the Brooklyn Museum exhibition, we have two built environments inside of a larger gallery space. Those built environments are actually the apartments, the domestic apartments of Dreyer that saw the beginnings, of the Société Anonyme. It was this combination space that they relied on as a way of showing what they had. And so this idea that the domestic plays into it, that it's the whole collection, is something that I talked about over the summer with regard to Gertrude Stein and even John Soane, whose home we're going to go and check out in London. I can't wait to bring you guys into this because it's the same conversation, and this notion that there's a kind of specialness or an originality to the idea of putting artwork in your home is silly. It's not the case. What is the case is there's been this entrenched understanding that what the domestic is influences the mana and also the hue of the object of the thing, especially when the thing leaves that salon. When the thing leaves that apartment, they leave with a stamp of that place. They leave with the ghost of that place, the hau of that place. So, other interiors that we can talk about with regard to this is, I always want to slip up and say Harvey Danger because I'm a kid from the 90s. Henry Darger's studio in Chicago. Now, I've talked to you about Henry Darger's work. This is a piece from the story of the Vivian Girls. Darger was a recluse in Chicago in the middle of the 20th century, and he was a janitor at a boarding school and had no family to speak of. and was pretty much a loner. He was the loner that we all see, that we all make funny comments about, or made funny comments about, excuse me, when we were children, because adults don't do that. And he basically would wear this military coat and shuffle around Chicago to and from his job, and he would go back to his apartment, and nobody knew anything about him. And he died. And when he died, his landlords opened the apartment, and this is what they found. They found it full of material, because Darger had not just been walking to and from work in this kind of bored haze. He was walking to and from work and imagining this very luscious, very vivid reality that told the story of the five or I don't think there's five. Vivian girls. I'll just say Vivian girls. I won't enumerate them. There's five young ladies in this image, though. Essentially, Darger, who came from a life of abuse and foster care, saw a kind of empowerment in this collection of young women. And so while our immediate hackles go up when we hear about a man shuffling around in a military coat who's making images of little girls, but the conversation is different here. Darger saw these young women as being able to fight against certain kinds of violences and certain kinds of authorities. He was in the 1940s doing things that the feminists would really latch onto and really gravitate towards. This idea that a collective of female identified humans can come together and crush authoritarian agents and authoritarian power structures. Way to go, Henry. He would do all of this through the use of copying. Essentially, he would make traceable transfers from advertisements for dolls. It was all doll culture. And so what you can see here are various cut and pasted moments where this head might come from one doll, this body might come from another advertisement for a doll, excuse me. This is the advertisement for one doll, this is the advertisement for another doll. And he would just shuffle them around and make these really wonderful arrangements. Here is another more detailed image, although it's smaller for you all to see, but oftentimes these are two-sided, and what you can see in this interior shot is him actually in the production of one of them when he died. So all of that is to say that the interior space was an augment to the finding of this book, because they walked in, they found this thing, and they said, man, this guy was really kind of a hoarder, but he was a really dedicated hoarder. And then they found this collection of things. And it was this collection of things that made them realize that there was something that was very, very special going on inside of this domestic interior, inside of this man's living space. And it was the incredible and prolific development of the story of the Vivian girls. Largely, that book is referred to as in the realm of the unreal. There's a film of that same title that details the story of the Vivian girls and mirrors it with Darger's life. That's absolutely incredible if you haven't seen it. And all of that is to say that this was identified as being so important that it was taken out of its space in Chicago and put piece by piece into a place called the Intuit Gallery, also in Chicago. The Intuit specializes in what's referred to as outsider art. I will always and forever think that the term outsider art is problematic. But essentially, you can see in this image that Darger has made work for his own for the adornment of his own walls, but he also has developed quite an extensive collection of other things. These knickknacks that just rest on his shelves. There's obviously religious iconography that you can see up here. I say obviously for no reason. He was a religious man, and that's a thing. But he has this collection of things, and then here is, as you can see, his working table and the collection of some other stuff. So Darger's interior, like the interior of Louise Roget in the Grant McCracken text, is one that is so fastidiously put together that it presents a very specific kind of person, a very specific kind of lived world. The same thing can be said for the lived experience of Catherine Dreyer, who lived with the works that were not only of Marcel Duchamp, which is crazy. Can you imagine living with a large glass? Jeez. But also other works, because Société Anonyme was actually a collecting agency. They bought works and developed a collection that was later bequeathed to the Yale art galleries. So they're in New Haven. And so this idea that an interior space can become not only, I guess the easiest way to say this before I switch gears slightly to talk about another M word is to say that, like the human body that was Joseph Beuys in the transmission of the how to the hat, the transmission of how through Beuys's mana, the apartments and the collections and the interior spaces and all of the complexity therein is part of the mana of these spaces. And yeah, I find that to be, it's old hat. We get it. Oh, the reason why I care for that thing is because it came from my grandmother's house. I've said that about stuff. Okay, I'm gonna switch gears and talk to you about there we go. An exhibition really quickly that has to do with actually, I'm not going to talk to you about this one. I want to talk to you about this one. Oops. So this is an exhibition called Fetiche that was at Venus over Manhattan, which was in the gallery building that houses Gagosian on the Upper East Side near the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was on the map. Some of you might have had the opportunity to pop down and see this show or to walk through that gallery building. Some of you might not have, but essentially, let me turn this off. The reason that I wanted to show you this exhibition was to talk about the idea, this other idea that's associated with agency and objects, and that is Mehrwert. That word is spelled Mehrwert, and you would put that in italics because that word is German. That is a German word that essentially translates directly into pay off. It can otherwise be referred to as surplus value. And I don't know why I just said value like that, but I did. That the idea and the research that I've done into this comes largely from a guy named Diedrich Diedrichson, which is such an awesome name for an art historian. But anyway, Diedrich Diedrichson talks about Mehrwert as the aspect of art that cannot be captured in words. So that thing that I've said earlier about my clay pot and was vibe. It has this vibe that it gives off. In the Masumi text, he talks about intensity or immensity, excuse me, or he also refers to it as affect. There is essentially something that radiates off of really everything. Like every single thing has this radiance to it, but art has a different kind of radiance because there's a different kind of intentionality. It's as though the person who holds the mana has a certain kind of agent, auratic push or impulse. You as the maker, in other words, have a desire to convey a specific kind of meaning. You want your viewer to be affected in some way by the thing that you are putting in front of them. And so in order to do that, in order to jam all that stuff into an object, you need to make it into a fetish. A fetish is a physical object that has this kind of how power, agency, authority added to it. Or mana, excuse me. Hau is the engine of reciprocity, right? We're talking about mana here. So these things have this mana. But as Diedrichsen talks about, they also have, because we're talking about consumerism, because we're talking about capital, and because we're talking about Karl Marx, they have this Mehrwert. Because Mehrwert is a way to talk about mana in economic terms. Because Mehrwert is an economic term. It talks into German economic discourses. It talks into, which are Marxist theory, and therefore it talks into all of capitalism. So Mehrwert is the reason why artwork is expensive. Mehrwert is the reason why artists make such an erratic amount of money. Mehrwert is the reason why people want to steal art. It is as quantifiable as mana can get, essentially. That's the easiest way to say that. Another way to look at this would just be the auction. An auction, in any sense, is something that really is about mana. Now, taking Mehrwert and getting back to this idea of this show, Fetish, this was one of my favorite works in the show. It was a really tiny, as you can see, 3 3/4 by 9 by 4 inches cube, and there are all of these little nails added to it, but it has a photographic process to the outside which renders that kind of rainbow effect to it. Samaras is a photographer, so he's a maker of images, a producer of two-dimensional work largely, but he also had, like Joseph Beuys, a kind of shamanistic quality or air to him, a shamanistic mana. And in the production of his works, there was always this gesture of hand. He wanted to use his hand to make a mark specifically in the Polaroid. He would take self-portraits of, obviously, of himself in his apartment with a Polaroid, and then he would use pins, much like these pins, to mark the surface, to create a stippled effect, to draw lines. I'm not showing you any of those works, but because I want you to focus on this thing. I'm telling you how he uses those pins. I'm telling you also how he uses photographic processes. I'm telling you how he doesn't make three-dimensional work. And all of those things are beginning to make you register this object that's digitally reproduced in front of your face in a way that is more fetishistic. The more details you have about a thing, the more you want to get into it or get away from it, but you have a stronger relationship to it. And with regard to fetish specifically, you want to get into it. You want to touch that thing. I really wanted to touch this thing, but I didn't. But the security guard knew that I did, and that's why he was standing really, really, really close to me while I was looking at this thing, because, man, I wanted to touch that thing. But anyway, you can't. Don't do it. And so, yeah, Mehrwert. But the other thing about Mehrwert, and the reason why you can address it in basic economic terms, or this notion of surplus value in economic terms, is that the reason why this little block in particular looks like this, why it sits on a white pedestal to be photographed, to be put online for an art gallery to reference an exhibition that they had, is because it is produced by a certain person that has a certain mana. The idea that anybody can make a modernist painting is really frustrating for a lot of reasons, but one of the primary ones is the fact that no, you cannot make a Jackson Pollock because only a Jackson Pollock can make a Jackson Pollock. You can make a painting, that's totally fine, but you will never, ever be able to make the work of someone else. Even if you forge the thing, it's still your forgery of the thing. Hot button issue for art historians to talk about. My kid could have done it. So anyway, Mehrwert, mana, all these are relative to actually exchange value and exchange ideas. And so when thinking about things like the titans that you bring into your studio every time you walk in there, like who's with you there? Who's your influence? Who's helping you make the work? Who's nudging you along? Who's giving you bad advice? What, who is haunting you? And how is that person, how is that entity being represented in your studio space? Do you have a painting by a friend that you love dearly and have a kind of spiritual connection with because you need their support in your studio? Or do you have a paint cup that was given to you by a teacher who didn't believe in you and you have it there as an act of resistance against their not believing in you? I'm making up totally hypothetical things right now. I've never heard of people having either of those things, but think about it in those terms. We're talking about addressing the physical architecture of these spaces. We're talking about bringing these ideas home, essentially. And so you do this. You have all of the capabilities, and you already do this. So it's not even about capabilities. It's just about identifying that they exist. Now, when thinking about McCracken, that indicates a kind of a personalized historical aura, right? Because we're talking about auratic objects. For Crimp, that aura can be disrupted, and that's why he talks about the museum's ruins, because you can disrupt the hau or the haunting, and you can imbue a different kind of haunt. If I steal something and paint it a different color and put it out into the world, I disassociate the first part of its life and give it a different part of its life. But I'm actually getting ahead of myself when I start talking about the life cycle of objects. That's for the Kryptikov text, which is long and awesome. Read the Masumi text, and yeah, keep up the great work. It's been a really awesome term. So thanks. Bye.